morning. We're going to be tying up a Red Fox Squirrel Nymph this morning. This is a Dave Whitlock pattern, and we'll be using some Whitlock stubbing. I'm just going to go ahead and get my thread started on my hook. We'll just go ahead and clip off the tag end there. And I've got a size 16 nymph hook in the vise, and I'm using just a rusty orange thread. We'll start this pattern out by putting just a little bit of lead on it. So I'm going to go ahead and tie this little piece of lead on here. And once I've got a couple of wraps on it, I'm going to wrap on the other side of it. And then I'm going to tightly wrap, touching turns, moving back, and let that lead kind of push my thread backwards as I go along. This is going to give us a little bit of extra bulk for our thorax, but it'll also help us with getting it down in the water. Once I've got about that many turns into it, I'm going to go ahead and take my thread with a couple of wraps over the top of it while I'm tweaking it back and forth until it breaks off, and that's going to give us a really nice base to tie this pattern. We are going to put a gold rib on here, so I've got a piece of flat gold rib that I'm going to tie on, and I want that to stay on the lens side of the hook if at all possible. That will help us because we will be putting a tail in here. I'm just going to take a few wraps backwards, and then I'm going to pull this back until it's behind that lead there, so we just don't end up with too much extra bulk at the back end here. And that's, right about where the barb is. Of course, I'll mash that barb down before I fish with it, but it's a good reference. So we've got it kind of going this far, and it's time to turn to our next material. So we're going to tie in a kind of a stubby little tail, and we're going to use, I've got a squirrel skin here, and I've cut off a little bunch of the material from that squirrel, and usually it's got some really fine underhair, and usually I just pinch it really tight, and I just do this with my fingers until I kind of work most of that out of there. This is too fine for me anyway to use more of the brush technique, so I'm going to use this. Then I'm going to just switch hands. I can see what I've got. I've removed a few of the guard hairs that are really, really long. And now I'm just going to measure, knowing I want to keep this pretty tight and short. Then I'm just going to pinch wrap on the top of my hook here. We'll go ahead and take some counterclockwise turns to make sure that that thread is coming back towards me. And we're going to want to make sure, number one, we get it secure, but number two, that we keep this on the very top of the shank of the hook here. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on at the moment. And you can see when I let go, we've got a nice short tail there. I'm going to just come in with my scissors here, and we'll just go ahead and cut off the balance of the butt ends of that squirrel. So once I've got the butt ends kind of trimmed out about where I want them, I'm going to just take some wraps to lock those down and into place right behind that lead. And you can see there's still a few little pieces sticking up, but that's okay. I'm going to start traveling our thread backwards. I'm going to turn it counterclockwise just to flatten it out a little bit so it doesn't make quite as much bulk. I'm just going to come back close to the tail, not all the way to the tail. And then I've got a nice little pack of dubbing here, and this is the Whitlock's. So this is Dave Whitlock's dubbing blend, and for the body we're going to use a Red Fox Squirrel. That's what we're going to use for our abdomen, and we do want to taper on this. So I'm going to give myself a little bit of thread and turn my vise a little bit, grab that dubbing, and start dubbing, finger dubbing it on my thread here. And I probably have more than I need, so that's okay. We'll rip it off when we get there. You'll notice I've left a little bit of a gap with the dubbing here, and that's so I can take a few wraps backwards back to the tail here before I start, my dubbing actually starts. So my dubbing is now started. I will tighten it as I go along because I don't want it to be overly lumpy here, but we do want to build in a taper. That's probably going to be good enough for me, so I'm just going to go ahead and pull the rest of that dubbing kind of off of my thread. Take a couple thread wraps back to secure the dubbing in place. I'm just going to turn my vise a little bit, grab my scissors, and kind of hold up this little extra bunch of dubbing that I didn't need, and go ahead and get that clipped off. So now let's go ahead and use we'll take some open wraps with our gold flat wire, and by tying that on the far side of the hook towards the lens, you'll notice I'm able to take that first wrap without really interrupting that tail at all. So we'll just take some nice open wraps with this. We'll probably just get 4 wraps in there before we have enough, and we'll just tie it off and remove it. So I'm going to go ahead and secure that thread or that wire here, and then we'll take a wrap or 2 in front of it as well, and then we'll just helicopter it off just like we always do with the metal. Just that friction and moving it back and forth, it will break itself off. So next we'll go ahead and turn to our thorax. Again, we're going to be using the Whitlock's dubbing. In this case, we're going to be using the Red Fox Squirrel Thorax. These are just labeled fantastically. They tell you exactly what they're for. It's a little bit darker, and we are going to want to make sure we have a pronounced thorax here. So I may end up coming back and taking a couple of dips into that dubbing. I'm going to go ahead and finger dub this dubbing on our thread here. I'll slide it on up. Start taking wraps. I'm going to actually wrap backwards over the top of a couple of those wraps of the abdomen. And I will just keep tightening this as we go along, just so that we're creating this really nice pronounced thorax. And I'm trying really hard not to overly crowd the eye of the hook, because we are going to put a soft hackle on here. So we've got it there. The soft hackle, I'm just going to turn to a nice kind of speckled hen saddle. I've pulled myself a feather out. You can see that they're fairly long, and these feathers, just like most feathers, have all this fuzzy stuff at the bottom. And so I'm just going to turn my feather so it's horizontal, grab it by the tip, and I'm just going to carefully strip those fuzzy bits off here. Just about like that. That leaves us with something that looks about like this. This is going to be a very sparse soft hackle, so I want to take a little bit more off here. And I want to have about the same amount of fibers on either side. So you'll want to just pay attention to what you're doing a little bit. So you can see we're left with that. Once I have that, I'm going to actually just grab my tweezers here. And I'm going to try to grab as close to the center as I can. And hold that tight. I'll wet my fingers, and I'm going to pull those fibers backwards. Once I have that, I'm going to just come in with my scissors, and I'm going to cut it so there's just a tiny little triangle left. That's going to be our tie-in point, is that nice little triangle. It would not hurt at all for you to wax your thread at this point as well. It'll just help it get more of a grip on that tie-in point. I turned my thread counterclockwise so that I could get it to kind of go backwards for me. And I'm just going to go ahead and take some pretty tight turns to just lock that back end of the soft hackle into place. So once I have my thread kind of where I want it, my hackle, soft hackle's kind of prepared, I'm just going to grab a hackle plier. For this, I like this kind of hackle plier a little bit, where you can kind of keep a little bit of distance here. And again, this is finesse. This is where you've got to just be very gentle, or you will actually break that hackle right off. So I'm going to be really careful in standing it up. And as I stand it up, I'm going to try to wrap some of the, pull some of those fibers backwards by wetting my fingers. And then not a lot of pressure, but some pressure. We'll take a wrap. You can see we're ending up with some of those hackle fibers going forward. That's fine. We'll fix that. We'll just continue to work on pulling those hackle fibers backwards as much as we possibly can. And again, we want a pretty sparse collar here. So let's go ahead and continue to pull all of that material backwards. We're probably going to get one more wrap in here. Just about like that. From there, I'm going to go ahead, we're going to grab our thread, and we're going to throw it over the top of the stem here. And that's just going to secure our stem in place. Keep this fellow from coming unwrapped. With that, I can release my hackle plier. I'm going to come on in, see exactly where this stem is connecting. I'm going to get my scissors and I'm going to cut that right up against the fly there. About like that. And yeah, we do have a little bit of a mess, but that's okay. We're going to actually stroke these fibers backwards, and we're going to wrap right over the top of them. And that's going to help us ensure that they end up laying backwards the way that we want them to. So you can see, for the most part, they've cooperated with me. So with that, we'll just go ahead and we'll grab our whip finisher. Take a few turns towards by the eye of the hook, but then I want to have these turns move backwards. So we are building up, the bulk that we build up is back towards where that soft hackle is and not by the eye of the hook. I'll just take a few thread wraps there, carefully kind of release it, pull it tight. We'll use the back end of our whip finisher to release our thread. And with that, we are good to go. Wonderful pattern. This is the Red Fox Squirrel Nymph. Very effective. A Dave Whitlock pattern. Find yourself a hook, put it in your vise, have some fun.